What happened over the last few days is being talked about everywhere, but almost nobody is explaining what it actually means. And by the time most people finally understand it, the leverage will already have moved permanently. Because the United States, the most powerful military force on Earth, ran into something it did not expect, an opponent that did not blink, did not break, and did not step away from the table. Instead, it held its ground and quietly forced the entire conversation to begin rotating around its own conditions. That is why this is bigger than another headline out of the Middle East. Because buried inside this moment is a much larger story about pressure, about power, about oil, about diplomacy, and about the point where a regional confrontation stops behaving like a regional crisis and starts reshaping the global economy in real time. And once that shift begins, it does not wait for the headlines to catch up. So, I am asking you directly to follow Market Mindset and also our backup channel, Market Mindset 2, because every single comment, every share, and every bit of support tells me to keep going with even more force. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back to the assumption that has driven Western policy toward Iran for decades, which was simple on paper and disastrous in practice. The belief was that enough sanctions, enough pressure, enough isolation, and enough economic pain would eventually force Tehran to surrender on Washington's terms. That logic sounded clean in speeches, looked tough in headlines, and helped shape years of policy decisions. But in the real world, countries do not always collapse under pressure. And sometimes pressure simply teaches them how to survive, adapt, and turn the same pressure into a weapon of their own. Iran did not disappear under sanctions. It did not quietly submit, and it did not become weaker in the way many analysts assumed. Instead of breaking apart, it built parallel trade routes, deepened strategic ties, strengthened internal manufacturing, and learned how to turn isolation into leverage. That is why this story is so important, because what looked from Washington like containment looked from Tehran like preparation, and preparation changes everything when the moment of confrontation finally arrives. When the latest escalation cycle reached its peak, the tone from the American side became sharper, more aggressive, and more public, with language that suggested military options were no longer a distant possibility, but a very real part of the discussion. That was supposed to pressure Iran into softening first, but instead it triggered the opposite effect. Once the pressure became visible, Tehran responded in a way that instantly changed the entire atmosphere around the negotiation. The first signal was military readiness. The second was strategic positioning. The third was psychological, because state messaging began to frame the moment not as panic or retreat, but as an approaching victory. That is exactly the kind of framing that locks a leadership into a stronger negotiating posture. And that is the part many people miss, because negotiations are never only about words at the table. They are about who walks in with confidence, who walks in with fear, and who walks in knowing the other side cannot easily afford to let the situation spiral out of control. The biggest pressure point in this story is the Strait of Hormuz, because this narrow waterway is not just a line on a map. It is one of the most important energy choke points in the world, and even the possibility of disruption can send shockwaves through oil markets within hours. That is why every serious strategist watches Hormuz closely. The moment shipping risk rises, insurance costs rise, transport costs rise, oil futures react, and the impact begins traveling far beyond the Gulf and into households across the West. This is where the story stops being theoretical. Because when oil moves, inflation moves, fuel prices move, and political pressure moves. That means a confrontation in the Gulf can very quickly become a kitchen table issue in America, Britain, and Canada. At the same time, Iran understands that it does not need to actually close the strait to gain leverage, because credibility alone is enough to change the market mood. And once that fear is credible, every trader, insurer, and policymaker starts recalculating the cost of escalation. That is why the reported discussion around transit fees and non-dollar pricing matters so much, because whether or not every final detail survives, the message is already clear. And the message is that Tehran now believes it can monetize its strategic position rather than simply defend it. Once that kind of message enters the negotiation space, the whole tone changes. The discussion is no longer only about sanctions or inspections. It becomes about who controls the next move, and who pays the bigger price if the talks collapse. That pressure did not exist in a vacuum either, because China and Russia both stepped into the conversation with public positions that supported Iranian sovereignty and warned against unilateral military action. And that instantly made the diplomatic math far more complicated for Washington. Those statements were not just diplomatic noise. They narrowed the path toward international legitimacy for any forceful American move and turned what might have been framed as a regional response into a much larger geopolitical confrontation. This is the part where the story expands beyond one country and one negotiation. Now, the issue is no longer just what Iran wants or what America wants, but how the entire global system reacts when the energy arteries of the world start to feel fragile. Gulf states suddenly find themselves in the hardest position imaginable because they rely on American security guarantees, host sensitive military infrastructure, and also live next to the very strategic choke point that can be turned into a pressure lever almost overnight. That is why private pressure from Gulf capitals matters, because behind closed doors, the message is simple: do not let this spiral. Do not force a miscalculation, and do not make the region pay the price for a showdown that can still be avoided. In a situation like this, nobody wants to be the actor who triggered the chain reaction, because once shipping is threatened, markets panic, airlines adjust, consumers feel the pain, and every government involved starts facing questions it would rather avoid. The reported ceasefire window creates time. But time is not the same as peace, and time is not the same as resolution. All it really does is pause the visible conflict while the real bargaining continues in quieter rooms behind closed doors. And that is where the next layer of this story begins, because the opening position in negotiations is often the most important position. And if Iran enters with its priorities already shaping the framework, then that means the leverage has already been redistributed before the first real compromise is even discussed. From Washington's side, this is a dangerous moment politically, because no American administration wants to be seen as weak. Yet no administration wants to carry the economic fallout of a wider Middle East confrontation either, especially when energy prices can become a domestic crisis almost instantly. That creates a painful contradiction. The more loudly a government talks toughness, the more it risks being trapped by the consequences of actually using it. And Iran understands that contradiction extremely well. On the Iranian side, the leadership also needs to show strength, because after years of sanctions and pressure, the domestic audience expects proof that endurance has produced leverage and that the country has not merely survived, but learned how to force respect. So both sides need something from this moment, but only one side appears to have shaped the conditions of entry. And that is what makes this episode so structurally important. If you are watching from the United States, this story is not remote at all, because any disruption in the Gulf can hit fuel prices, inflation expectations, market sentiment, and political trust in a matter of days, not months. And when energy costs climb, the people who suffer first are rarely the ones with the most cushion. It is the commuters, the workers, the families on tight budgets, and the households already stretched thin that feel the impact first and hardest. That is why this is not just a geopolitical chess match, because behind every diplomatic statement is a real-world economic effect that touches ordinary people long before analysts on television finish debating the outcome. For the United Kingdom, the stakes are similarly serious, because energy security remains a sensitive issue, and even the possibility of renewed instability in the Gulf can affect prices, planning, and public confidence in economic stability. Britain also has to think carefully about its own sanctions framework, because any deal that changes the balance of pressure on Iran will force policy recalibration, legal review, and diplomatic adjustment inside institutions that prefer predictability over sudden shifts. For Canada, the impact may be indirect, but it is still real, because global oil benchmarks respond to Gulf tension, and those benchmark changes influence export dynamics, fiscal planning, and broader economic expectations in ways that can spread quietly but powerfully. And here is the point you need to pay attention to, because the real question is not just whether this negotiation happens, but whether this becomes a permanent change in the balance of power, or only a temporary pause before the next escalation cycle begins. That is why sanctions relief is such a critical issue, because even partial relief would signal that pressure alone did not force compliance. And that message would echo far beyond Iran into every future confrontation where Washington tries to use economic force as its main weapon. The nuclear issue still matters deeply, but the key shift is that it is no longer positioned as a wall-blocking talks. It is now part of the talks, which means Iran has already won something important by forcing the conversation to move onto its preferred terrain. That single shift matters because it changes the order of bargaining, the psychology of the table, and the public perception of who is leading and who is reacting. The regional file is even broader because Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and the wider network of aligned actors are all part of the security architecture that has evolved over time. And none of these pieces can be dealt with cleanly in a single meeting or single ceasefire window. That is why any serious agreement will take months of phased implementation, constant verification, and carefully worded compromises. Because the deeper the strategic entanglement, the slower the unwinding. And this is the point where the story becomes bigger than Iran itself. Every country watching this will learn a lesson from how the pressure campaign performed under stress. And that lesson will shape future diplomacy, sanction strategy, and military signaling around the world. If the maximum pressure model does not fully deliver the result the West expected, then other governments under sanction will notice immediately, and so will their advisors, bankers, diplomats, and military planners. That is why the next 2 weeks matter so much, because the ceasefire window is not the end of the story. It is the narrow space inside which the most important bargaining will happen away from cameras, away from speeches, and away from public posturing. Watch sanctions language carefully, because the pace, structure, and scope of any relief will tell you more about the balance of power than any public celebration ever could. Watch the nuclear wording carefully, because what is said about verification, enrichment, timelines, and inspection access will reveal whether the talks are genuine compromise or merely a tactical pause. Watch regional security guarantees carefully, because the Gulf states will not be passive spectators, and their private concerns may shape the final structure of any deal more than the public statements suggest. Watch the energy market carefully too, because even when nothing dramatic happens on the surface, the expectation of stability or instability can move prices, and prices often move faster than the diplomacy meant to contain them. This is why the whole situation feels larger than a single negotiation, because it is really about whether pressure still works the way policymakers want it to, or whether the world has entered a phase where strategic resilience can outlast economic coercion. And if that is true, then this moment becomes a turning point. Not because one side completely defeated the other, but because the assumptions beneath decades of policy were visibly challenged in front of the entire world. That kind of shift does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a meeting, a ceasefire, a statement, and a set of terms that quietly reveal who held the stronger hand when the pressure peaked. So the real story here is not only what happened, but what this tells us about the future of power. Because if leverage can be rebuilt under sanctions and converted into negotiating strength, then the old playbook is no longer guaranteed to work. That has consequences for the United States, for its allies, for the global oil market, for the credibility of sanctions, and for every government that has been told for years that economic pressure alone can force political surrender. It also has consequences for ordinary families, because when geopolitical tensions travel through energy markets, they do not stay abstract for long. They become the difference between manageable bills and painful bills, between stability and uncertainty, between calm and stress. And that is why you should keep watching this story closely. Because the visible headline may fade quickly, but the underlying negotiations, the real leverage shifts, and the long-term consequences will keep unfolding long after the cameras move on. We are looking at a structural reset, not just a temporary headline. And whether that reset leads to a durable deal or another round of escalation will depend on what happens in the quiet rooms over the next several days and weeks. The next move matters, the next statement matters, and the next concession matters. Because in a situation like this, small details can decide whether the world gets stability or another crisis. So, tell me your view in the comments. Do you think Iran has genuinely changed the balance of leverage here? Or is this only a pause before the next confrontation? And if you are watching from the US, UK, or Canada, How should your government respond to a deal that includes partial sanctions relief? If this breakdown helped you understand the bigger picture, please like, share, comment your opinion, and subscribe to Market Mindset for more deep analysis like this, because your support is what keeps these reports strong, consistent, and worth making every single time.